Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear, modern understanding.
This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human-researched and written material.
So to start us off today, I want you to just imagine a king. He's on his deathbed, totally consumed by paranoia.
Right.
And meanwhile, his son, the heir to the throne, is hiding out in, well, basically a dive bar across town.
Just completely avoiding his responsibilities.
Exactly. He's trying on this fake personality just to survive the really intense, crushing weight of public judgment.
It's a heavy burden.
It is. And we're looking at a kingdom that is just teetering on the edge of total collapse. I mean, it's driven by fake news, political polarization, and leaders who basically view the general public as a monster.
A monster to be manipulated.
Totally manipulated.
Yeah.
So today in this deep dive, we are looking at a 400-year-old political crisis that honestly, it perfectly predicts the PR spin, the echo chambers, and the brutal statecraft of our modern era.
It's uncanny how relevant it is.
It really is. Our mission today is to explore this profound intersection of power, aging, and escapism by unpacking William Shakespeare's Henry IV, Part 2.
And we are pairing that text with a brilliant, really classic literary commentary by the 19th century essayist William Hazlitt.
Okay, let's unpack this because it's a phenomenal pairing of source materials. Right?
Oh, absolutely. Because, you have Shakespeare presenting this incredibly murky, morally ambiguous transitional period in English history.
Right.
And then you have Hazlitt. He's writing in the early 1800s. And he approaches these characters not just as historical figures on a page, but as living, breathing, psychological case studies.
Which changes everything.
It does. And to understand why Hazlitt is our lens for this deep dive, we have to look at his specific philosophical background.
Right, because he's a romantic.
Exactly. William Hazlitt was writing in the aftermath of the French Revolution. He was a romantic through and through. And
the Romantics saw the world very differently than the Elizabethans did.
Completely differently. I mean, the Elizabethans of Shakespeare's time, they valued absolute order. They believed in the divine right of kings, and the stability of the state was prized above all else.
Keep the machine running no matter what.
Right. But the Romantics, they valued the individual, the imagination, and really the rebellion against cold, sterile authority.
Which means Hazlitt just completely flips the traditional script on this play.
He really does.
Instead of viewing the serious political figures as the heroes, he looks at the rebels, the outcasts, and specifically this massive, rule-breaking tavern knight.
Sir John Falstaff.
Sir John Falstaff. Hazlitt sees him as the emotional center of the universe.
He's the gravitational pull of the whole text.
He is. So for you listening, whether you study leadership dynamics or you're fascinated by the cyclical nature of history, or, if you just want to understand the mechanics of one of the greatest comic characters ever constructed.
Which Falstaff definitely is.
Boy, for sure. This deep dive is going to dissect how the tension between duty and desire hasn't changed a bit in 4 centuries.
Well, we should probably establish the board before we start moving the pieces around.
Good call. Give us the lay of the land.
So we are entering an England that is completely fractured by civil war.
Right.
King Henry IV is ailing. He's suffering physically and mentally, and he's just burdened by this immense guilt over how he violently deposed the previous monarch, Richard II, to take the crown in the first place.
Yeah, that guilt is just eating him alive.
It really is. And then his son, Prince Hal, he's caught in this existential trap. He's avoiding the court, avoiding his destiny, hanging out in taverns.
Which brings us back to Falstaff.
Exactly. We have Sir John Falstaff, a man who essentially operates as a walking, talking mockery of all this serious life or death political scheming.
So let's unpack the environment they are operating in because, well, none of these characters are making decisions in a vacuum.
Right. They're operating in the thick of it.
They're in the fog of war. And Shakespeare doesn't just give us a standard prologue to explain the history here. He introduces a personified concept to explain the epistemology of this world.
The stage direction is just wild.
It literally reads, "Enter rumor, painted full of tongues."
It's an incredibly surreal and unsettling image to open a history play with.
I mean, imagine being in the audience.
Right. You have an actor step onto the stage, draped in a garment covered in painted tongues, speaking directly to you.
This is aggressive.
It is. Rumor is not just a spreader of gossip here. Rumor is presented as a structural force of nature.
Yeah, it's systemic.
Exactly. This character boasts about the sheer scale of the operation, stating, and I quote, "Upon my tongues continual slanders ride, the which in every language I pronounce, stuffing the ears of men with false reports."
That phrase, stuffing the ears of men, it's so violent and invasive, isn't it?
It implies a total lack of consent.
Right. It implies that the public isn't willingly seeking out this false information. It's being aggressively shoved into their heads.
They're passive victims of it.
And rumor talks about making the wind his post horse, spreading stories of peace when there's actually hidden enmity, and broadcasting stories of war when the kingdom is at peace.
But the mechanism of how this works is what we really need to focus on.
Okay, lay it out.
So, rumor describes itself as a pipe. But it is a pipe blown by surmises, jealousies, and conjectures.
Wow.
Right. So the fuel for misinformation isn't just malicious intent from the top down.
It needs us to work.
Exactly. It requires the underlying anxieties and paranoia of the populace to actually make a sound.
It feeds on our own worst impulses.
And rumor has a very specific, almost contemptuous view of the audience it manipulates. It calls the masses the blunt monster with uncounted heads, the still discordant, wavering multitude.
The blunt monster with uncounted heads. I mean, that maps flawlessly onto the architecture of modern viral misinformation.
It's exactly the same mechanism.
It really is. The wavering multitude is basically the 21st century social media echo chamber.
Yes.
The pipe of rumor operates just like an engagement algorithm. It doesn't care about the truth at all. It only cares about what will elicit a reaction.
Whatever keeps you clicking.
Right. It feeds on jealousies and conjectures, our outrage, our tribalism, our fears. We become that blunt monster every time we share a sensationalized headline without actually verifying it.
We are the instrument being played.
We really are. And the play immediately demonstrates the devastating real-world consequences of this algorithmic spread of false reports.
The opening scene is just a masterclass in this.
Set the scene for us.
So it takes place in the immediate aftermath of the Battle of Shrewsbury. The rebels, led by the Percy family, have clashed with the king's forces, and rumor has intentionally flooded the zone with fake news that the rebels were victorious.
Which leads us to the castle of the Earl of Northumberland.
Right, the patriarch of the rebel faction.
He's the father of the great warrior Hotspur. Now, Northumberland was too sick to fight in the battle himself, so he is agonizingly waiting for updates at home.
The tension is just unbearable for him.
And then a messenger arrives. Lord Bardolph, not the tavern Bardolph who hangs out with the Falstaff, but a nobleman.
Right, different guy.
And Lord Bardolph delivers a report of absolute, unmitigated victory.
And the tragedy here is that Lord Bardolph is completely sincere.
He's not lying on purpose.
No, he has been infected by the false reports and is passing them on as absolute truth. He tells Northumberland that his son, Hotspur, has won a glorious victory.
That King Henry IV is wounded to the death.
And that Prince Hal has been slain outright by Hotspur. He uses this incredibly elevated language, comparing the victory to the triumphs of Julius Caesar.
So Northumberland is just eating this up.
Oh, the confirmation bias here is palpable. This is exactly what Northumberland wants to hear, so he accepts it without a drop of skepticism.
You can almost feel the collective sigh of relief in the castle.
Right. They think they've won the war.
But the triumph lasts maybe 2 minutes? Because another messenger, Morton, arrives on the scene.
And Morton's information is very different.
Because Morton wasn't getting his news from the Wind or the Whisper network. Morton was physically at the battle. He saw the reality.
And the reality is a total collapse.
A complete disaster. Hotspur is dead, killed in single combat by Prince Hal. The rebel army is shattered and fled. The king's forces are marching their way.
The psychological whiplash Northumberland experiences in that moment is a masterclass in the anatomy of sudden trauma.
So visceral.
He is forced to process the death of his son, the destruction of his family's legacy, and the imminent threat of his own execution, all within a matter of seconds.
Just a total system overload.
Exactly. And his initial reaction is fascinating. He says that if the news had been good, it would have made him sick with joy. But because the news is so catastrophic, the shock has temporarily cured his physical illness.
It is like watching an autoimmune response of the mind.
That's a great way to put it.
The body experiences such a catastrophic systemic shock that it starts attacking itself and everything around it. His grief doesn't manifest as weeping. It manifests as a desire for global annihilation.
He literally throws away his sick cat.
He throws away his crutch, and he calls for a scaly gauntlet of steel.
And he delivers this speech that basically advocates for the end of the world. He says, "Let heaven kiss earth. Now let not nature's hand keep the wild flood confined. Let order die.
He just wants it all to burn.
He actively desires that one spirit of the firstborn Cain reign in all bosoms. He wants everyone to succumb to the absolute worst, most murderous human instincts until darkness buries the dead.
He wants to burn the entire universe down simply because his son is no longer in it.
It is a terrifying display of raw, destructive emotion.
His allies actually have to step in and talk him down from the ledge.
They're like, whoa, calm down. We knew this was a possibility.
Right. They remind him that this was always a calculated risk. They knew the dole of blows might drop his son, but it perfectly illustrates how deeply this kingdom is tearing itself apart.
The fabric is just shredding.
And the rebellion doesn't die with Hotspur at Shrewsbury.
Mm-hmm.
The trauma just mutates into something new.
Right. The mutation of the rebellion forces us to examine the very nature of political justification. Because the next phase of the uprising isn't led by a secular military lord seeking territory.
It's led by a religious authority.
Exactly. The Archbishop of York.
Now, the sources outline a very complex political debate here, and it is crucial to view the arguments impartially. Shakespeare doesn't write cartoon villains.
No, everyone has their reasons.
The rebels have profound, historically rooted grievances, just as the king has a profound duty to maintain the state. We have to look at both sides.
And the Archbishop's core argument is sociological. He observes that the Commonwealth is sick of their own choice.
What does he mean by that?
Well, he notes the historical irony that the public absolutely loved King Henry IV when he first arrived in England as a rebel himself, seeking to overthrow the capricious Richard II.
Right, they cheered him in the streets.
But now that Henry is in power, the public is exhausted by him. The Archbishop takes this general secular dissatisfaction and elevates it to a divine mandate.
As one of the king's allies observes, the Archbishop turns insurrection to religion.
He weaponizes history. The rebels literally scrape the blood of the deposed Richard II from the stones of Pomfret Castle to create a religious relic.
A martyr.
A martyr, exactly. The Archbishop claims the entire land is bleeding and gasping for life under Henry's rule.
And the terminology they use is entirely medical.
It's all about disease and cures.
They argue that the Commonwealth is diseased, suffering from a burning fever, and the only cure is a radical bloodletting.
That medical metaphor permeates the entire text. The kingdom is sick, the king is physically sick, the body politic is infected.
So they don't see themselves as the bad guys.
Not at all. The rebels genuinely believe they're performing a necessary surgical intervention on the state. They don't view themselves as traitors, they view themselves as the immune system fighting off a pathogen.
But here's the crazy part. While the rebels are preparing this massive violent purge to cure the kingdom, the one person who should be stepping up to defend the crown, the heir apparent, Prince Hal, is completely absent from the political theater.
Is nowhere to be found.
While the rebels use the chaos to seize power, Prince Hal is using the chaos as a shield to hide from a public that is constantly scrutinizing him.
The psychology of Prince Hal is, well, it's one of the most intricate puzzles in the play.
It's so complicated.
It is. We finally see him, not in a war room, but in the streets of London, accompanied by his low-status companion, Poins. And his opening line in this scene just strips away all the regal mythology.
What's the line?
Before God, I am exceeding weary.
Exceeding weary. The Prince of Wales, the hero who just slew the great rebel Hotspur, is fundamentally exhausted.
And he is deeply ashamed of that exhaustion. He tells Poins that it discolors the complexion of my greatness to acknowledge it.
He's embarrassed that he's tired.
He's embarrassed that he desires a glass of small beer, which is a cheap, weak drink of the commoners, rather than something more fitting for a prince.
So Hal deflects his own vulnerability by going on this bizarre, mocking tangent about Poins' wardrobe.
Right, he just changes the subject entirely.
He starts teasing Poins about how many pairs of silk stockings he owns, making jokes about his linen.
But Poins is sharp and he pierces right through the deflection.
He doesn't let him get away with it.
No, Poins calls him out, essentially asking how Hal can talk so idly, how he can joke about stockings when his father, the king, is dying.
And Hal's response reveals the absolute trap of his existence. He admits to Poins that his heart bleeds inwardly for his father. He says he could be sad indeed.
But he knows with absolute certainty that he cannot display that sadness publicly.
This is where I have to look at Hal critically, though.
Okay, let's hear it.
If he is genuinely devastated by his father's illness, why is he drinking small beer in a tavern? Why is he keeping up this facade? Is he just a massive hypocrite who wants the crown but doesn't want to do the emotional labor of being a son?
It is the logical question to ask, and it's brilliant because Hal anticipates that exact judgment.
He knows how it looks.
He does. Hal explains the mechanics of his bind. He says, because I've kept such vile company as you and Falstaff, the public has already written my narrative.
They've made up their minds.
Exactly. If you were to suddenly weep for his father, he asks Poins how it would be received. And Poins, with brutal honesty, says, I would think thee a most princely hypocrite.
A princely hypocrite?
Yeah.
Wow. He is literally a prisoner of his own PR.
He built the cage himself.
He built this reputation as a wild, reckless youth, maybe as a way to avoid the crushing expectations of the throne. But now that reputation is an iron cage.
He's trapped.
He cannot express genuine human grief because the blunt monster with uncounted heads would just view it as a cynical performance. His isolation is profound. He's surrounded by people, yet completely alone in his reality.
Which raises the deeper question of intent. Why did he construct this specific cage?
Right. Why play the fool?
The king is despairing over Hal's association with the tavern crowd, but the Earl of Warwick offers a highly analytical defense of the prince's methodology.
And Warwick's argument frames Hal not as a delinquent, but as an undercover sociologist.
That's the perfect term for it.
Warwick tells the king that the prince is studying his companions like a strange tongue. You have to learn the most immodest, offensive words in a foreign language to truly understand how it functions.
Right. But that doesn't mean you plan to use those words when you're back in polite society.
Exactly.
Warwick is arguing that Hal is engaged in a long-term intelligence-gathering operation. He is mapping the kingdom from the gutter up, learning the dialects, the grievances, and the psychology of the common people.
It's strategic.
Very. Warwick assures the king that in the perfectness of time, Hal will cast off these followers. He will utilize this deep understanding of the common man to govern more effectively, turning his past evils into strategic advantages.
It is a defense that makes Hal look extremely competent.
Yes.
But it also makes him look incredibly cold.
Very calculated.
I mean, if Warwick is right, Hal is treating his friends as research subjects. He is mining them for data with a premeditated intention of discarding them.
It's ruthless when you think about it.
It really is. But if Hal is merely playing the role of a rogue, we have to look at the man who actually lives it.
Oh, yes.
The man the Chief Justice calls Hal's ill angel, Sir John Falstaff.
You really cannot analyze the architecture of this play without confronting the monumental presence of Falstaff.
You just can't.
He is the gravitational center that pulls against the cold mechanics of the state.
And this is where William Hazlitt's commentary provides such an incredible framework.
Hazlitt loves Falstaff.
He adores him. Hazlitt doesn't view Falstaff as a mere clown. He views him as a philosophical triumph. Hazlitt calls Falstaff perhaps the most substantial comic character that ever was invented, embodying the fullness of the spirit of wit and humor bodily.
And Hazlitt's genius is how he connects Falstaff's physical immense size to his intellectual capacity.
How does he frame it?
Well, Hazlitt argues that Falstaff's body is like a good estate to his mind, a vast property from which he receives endless rents and revenues of imagination.
I love that. He says Falstaff manures and nourishes his mind with jests in the exact same way he nourishes his physical body with sack, which is sweetened wine and sugar.
It's all consumption.
Hazlitt points out that Falstaff carves out his jokes the way he would carve a haunch of venison. It is an act of consumption and creation simultaneously.
And what makes Falstaff's wit so unique is that it lacks malice.
Right. He's not mean-spirited.
Not at all. A lot of comedic wit is driven by spleen-poking fun at others because the comedian is secretly miserable.
Taking people down a peg.
Exactly. But Falstaff's wit is an overflow of good nature and absolute, unapologetic self-contentment.
The operational speed of Falstaff's intellect under pressure is what fascinates Hazlitt the most, though.
Oh, he's so fast on his feet.
He notes Falstaff's masterly presence of mind. When confronted with a threat or an accusation, his repartees aren't premeditated calculations. They are involuntary suggestions of his self-love and instinctive evasions.
He operates like a master jazz improviser.
Exactly. He doesn't read the sheet music of societal rules. He just feels the tension in the room and plays the exact note required to escape it.
The scene with the Lord Chief Justice is the perfect example of this.
Yes, let's talk about that scene. The Lord Chief Justice represents the absolute bedrock of law and order.
The complete opposite of Falstaff.
Right, and he attempts to confront Falstaff about a robbery. The Chief Justice gets frustrated because Falstaff keeps dodging, and he says, "I think you are fallen into the disease, for you hear not what I say to you."
And Falstaff just pivots instantly.
Instantly. He pivots the context of the word disease, and he replies, "Very well, my lord, very well. Rather, and please you, it is the disease of not listening, the malady of not marking, that I am troubled withal."
He diffuses the authority of the Chief Justice by diagnosing himself with the literal act of ignoring the Chief Justice.
It's brilliant.
It is. He floats out of legal and moral difficulties on a sea of his own rich conceits.
But, and this is a big but, we have to confront the reality of his actions.
We do.
Falstaff is a liar. He is a coward on the battlefield. He is a glutton, a thief, and a parasite who manipulates poor tavern hostesses out of their life savings.
He's terrible on paper.
Why don't we, the audience, despise him?
Well, Hazlitt addresses this moral paradox head-on. He argues that we don't judge Falstaff morally because Falstaff operates entirely outside the framework of morality by turning himself into a conscious caricature.
He's in on the joke.
Exactly. He knows he's a liar and a coward, and he deliberately exaggerates those vices to absurd proportions simply to showcase the humorous mechanics of them.
So that he's performing.
Hazlitt writes that he's an actor in himself almost as much as upon the stage.
We don't judge him as a citizen. We judge him as an artist performing his own life. The unrestrained indulgence of his appetites has no hidden agenda.
Right. He's not scheming for the throne.
He isn't trying to overthrow the state. He just wants to enjoy the present moment.
Yeah.
He is the ultimate escapist fantasy.
And that concept of Falstaff as the ultimate performer is cemented in the famous tavern mock trial scene.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
Now, this actually occurs in part 1, but its psychological shadow looms over every single interaction in part 2.
You have to know this scene to understand part 2.
Hazlitt focuses heavily on this scene because it contains the entire tragic trajectory of the Falstaff-Hal relationship.
So in this scene, Hal and Falstaff are practicing for Hal's upcoming confrontation with the king.
They're role-playing.
First, Falstaff plays the king, wearing a cushion for a crown, and predictably uses the opportunity to praise himself, but then they switch roles.
And this is where it shifts.
Prince Hal plays his father, the king, and Falstaff plays Prince Hal.
The comedy immediately takes on a dark, prophetic tone.
Hal, speaking as the king, unleashes a brutal, unvarnished assessment of Falstaff. He calls him a trunk of humors, a swollen parcel of dropsies, a reverend vice, and a white-bearded Satan.
It is just a litany of disgust.
And Falstaff, playing Hal, defends himself. But notice how he defends himself. He doesn't claim to be honest or brave.
No, he knows better than that.
He defends his essential nature as a provider of joy. He says, "Banish points, banish Bardolph." But for sweet Jack Falstaff, kind Jack Falstaff, true Jack Falstaff, valiant Jack Falstaff, banish not him thy Harry's company.
It's so pleading.
And then he delivers the plea, "Banish plump Jack and banish all the world."
To which Prince Hal, embodying the king but also speaking as the monarch he will inevitably become, replies, "I do, I will."
It's chilling. Even in the midst of a tavern comedy routine, the cold reality of power asserts itself.
The inevitability of their separation is stated plainly.
The contrast between Falstaff's vibrant life force and the cold reality of the world becomes even sharper when we look at the men who serve as his foils in part 2.
Right, the men who highlight everything Falstaff is not.
Shakespeare juxtaposes Falstaff against the hollow men of the realm, both in the rural countryside and in the high courts of power.
Let's examine the countryside first.
Okay, take us to Gloucestershire.
Falstaff is traveling through Gloucestershire on a commission to recruit soldiers for the coming war. He stops at the estate of an old acquaintance, the country justice Robert Shallow.
And his silent partner, Justice Silence.
Yes. Hazlitt offers a deeply perceptive analysis of Justice Shallow. He identifies Shallow's primary characteristic as unmeaning tautology,
Which means?
his compulsive habit of repeating words and phrases, "Baron, baron, baron, beggars all, beggars all."
Just constantly repeating himself.
Constantly. Hazlitt diagnoses this not just as a quirk, but as a regal infirmity.
A regal infirmity.
It is the conversational habit of a man who is used to talking to sycophants, or a man like Silence who never offers a meaningful response.
Oh, so he has to fill the air himself.
Exactly. Shallow repeats himself to fill the intellectual void of his own existence.
Shallow is a deeply pathetic figure. He constantly romanticizes his youth in London, bragging about being a legendary brawler and a ladies' man, claiming to have done things that Falstaff knows are complete fabrications.
Falstaff sees right through him.
He totally does. Shallow asks Falstaff if he remembers those wild nights, and Falstaff, instead of his usual boisterous mockery, delivers a line of pure, quiet tragedy.
It's one of the most famous lines in the play.
He looks at this frail, babbling old man and simply says, "We have heard the chimes at midnight, Master Shallow."
We have heard the chimes at midnight. It is a profound acknowledgement of mortality.
The midnight bells have rung.
The party is over. The time for youthful rebellion has passed, and the grave is approaching.
Yet, Falstaff refuses to be dragged down by Shallow's sentimental decay. The moment Shallow leaves the stage, Falstaff turns to the audience and brutally deconstructs him.
He just tears him apart.
He says he sees the very bottom of Justice Shallow. He creates this vivid visual comedy, comparing the young Shallow to a forked radish, or a man made after supper of a cheese paring.
A cheese paring.
He says Shallow was the very genius of famine. Falstaff uses his wit to assert his intellectual supremacy, refusing to let age diminish his own vitality.
Now, if Shallow represents the harmless, decaying nostalgia of the rural world, the other major foil in the play represents the terrifying, lethal pragmatism of the state.
The total opposite end of the spectrum.
Right. While Falstaff is dodging his responsibilities in Gloucestershire, Prince John of Lancaster Hall's younger brother is commanding the king's army against the rebel forces at Gaultree Forest.
We need to spend time dissecting what happens at Gaultree Forest because it is an absolute masterclass in Machiavellian statecraft.
It is chilling.
Prince John agrees to a parley with the rebel leaders, the Archbishop, Mowbray, and Hastings. John opens a negotiation by aggressively questioning the Archbishop's moral authority.
Right, scolding him for turning holy books into weapons and using the shadow of God to justify shedding blood.
The Archbishop counters by presenting their formalized list of grievances. And here, the mechanics of the political trap are set.
Watch closely here.
Prince John reads the list and does something entirely unexpected in a military standoff. He agrees with them.
He just gives them everything they ask for.
He says, "I take your princely word for these redresses." He publicly promises that every single grievance will be addressed and fixed. He swears by the honor of his blood.
He validates their cause completely.
And to seal this new peace, John suggests they all drink together, friendly and embrace, so that both armies can witness their leaders reconciled.
So they drink?
The rebel leaders, believing they have achieved a bloodless political victory, send the command for their massive army to disband and return to their farms.
And the trap snaps shut the instant the leverage shifts.
As soon as the troops are gone.
The moment the rebel army is scattered and defenseless, Prince John drops the diplomatic mask. He orders his guards to arrest the Archbishop, Mowbray, and Hastings for high treason.
The rebel leaders are utterly stunned by the audacity of the lie. The Archbishop cries out, "Will you thus break your faith?"
And Prince John's response is the definition of a legalistic loophole.
What does he say?
He replies with chilling calmness that he promised to redress their grievances. He did not promise to spare their lives as rebels.
Oh, wow.
And then he sentences them to the block.
It is a breathtaking violation of trust. John even attributes the victory to divine intervention, saying God brought about this peace.
So cynical.
This is the essence of Machiavellian philosophy. The state prioritizes efficiency and order above personal honor. John avoided a bloody battle that could have cost thousands of lives, but he did so by sacrificing the very concept of chivalric truth.
So how do we interpret Shakespeare's view on this?
Well, he doesn't punish John. The heavens don't open up and strike him down. The statecraft is brutally successful.
But it leaves a foul taste in the mouth.
It really does. When you contrast Prince John's lethal betrayal with Falstaff's petty crimes, the moral landscape shifts. Falstaff might trick a hostess out of 10 pounds, but he would never orchestrate a mass execution with a cold, dead look in his eyes.
And the contrast is the point. Shakespeare is demonstrating that the survival of the state requires a ruthless, calculating ability to sever human connection and empathy.
A king cannot be a sentimentalist.
Exactly. And this realization that power requires cold pragmatism is exactly what King Henry IV understands his heir, Prince Hal, must learn to embody.
Which brings us to the climax of the play's psychological conflict, the ultimate collision between the demands of the crown and the humanity of the son.
We move to the Jerusalem chamber at Westminster.
The deathbed.
King Henry IV is in his final hours. He is suffering from an apoplectic fit and falls into a state so deep it mimics death.
Right.
Prince Hal enters the chamber and finds his father motionless. Beside the king, resting on a pillow, is the crown.
Hal's soliloquy over the crown is deeply introspective. He doesn't view it as a prize, he views it as a parasite.
A parasite, yeah.
He calls it a care on thee depending, that has fed upon the physical body of his father. He recognizes it as a heavy, dangerous, life-consuming inheritance. Believing the burden has now passed to him, he places the crown on his head and walks into the adjoining room to mourn in private.
But the tragedy of timing occurs.
The king wakes up.
The king awakens. He discovers the crown missing, and his paranoia, cultivated over years of rebellion and betrayal, instantly assumes the worst.
He assumes Hal stole it.
When he learns that Hal took the crown, his reaction is explosive and heartbreaking.
The king views this act through a lens of economic and biological betrayal. He uses the analogy of the hive.
Explain the hive analogy.
He says fathers break their sleep with care, building up fortunes, investing entirely in their sons. They act like bees, tolling from every flower, packing their thighs with wax and their mouths with honey, bringing it all back to the hive.
Only to be murdered for their pains.
Exactly. He accuses Hal of being a hasty heir, eager to bury his father before his time to seize the gold.
The confrontation that follows is the emotional resolution they have needed for two plays.
It's been building for so long.
Prince Hal returns, weeping genuinely, and delivers an impassioned, articulate defense. He explains that he did not take the crown in triumph.
He treated it as an enemy.
Yes, a murderer that had killed his father. He knelt to it in awe and terror, acknowledging the terrifying weight of the responsibility.
And the king recognizes the absolute truth in Hal's tears. The paranoia breaks, and they finally reconcile.
It's a beautiful moment.
But the fascinating turn is what the dying king offers as his final legacy. He doesn't offer a philosophical treatise on justice or morality.
He offers pure, unadulterated political strategy.
The king confesses the reality of his reign. He admits he acquired the crown through bypaths and indirect crooked ways.
He knows he stole it.
And that his entire kingship has been spent fighting the very allies who helped him steal it. So to prevent Hal from facing the same internal rebellions, he gives him the ultimate Machiavellian directive.
What is it?
Busy, giddy minds with foreign quarrels.
It is the classic wag the dog scenario.
Keep the populace focused on an external enemy so they don't scrutinize the leadership at home. Focus their aggression outward to forge an artificial unity out of internal division.
It is deeply cynical, but historically effective. And it signals that the era of internal civil war is ending, and the era of imperial conquest, the reign of King Henry V, is beginning.
The king passes away. The prince is now King Henry V. And the narrative moves inexorably toward the moment we have been anticipating and dreading since the mock trial in the tavern.
The reckoning.
The news of the king's death reaches the rural quiet of Gloucestershire. Falstaff's reaction is pure, unrestrained euphoria.
He thinks he's made it.
He tells Justice Shallow to choose any office in the land, declaring that the laws of England are now at his commandment. He mounts up and rushes to London, fully expecting to be elevated to the highest levels of power.
The visual setup of the final scene is critical here.
Falstaff stands in the muddy street as the immaculate coronation procession approaches. As the new king rides past, Falstaff calls out, "God save thy grace, King Hal, my royal Hal."
He is bursting with genuine affection and anticipation.
The new king stops. He looks down at Falstaff, the man who served as a surrogate father, the man who taught him the language of the people, the embodiment of wit and vitality.
And King Henry V delivers the severing blow.
"I know thee not, old man. Fall to thy prayers."
It's devastating.
He doesn't just banish him. He publicly humiliates him. He tells Falstaff how ill white hairs becomes a fool and jester. He admonishes him to leave his gormandizing, brutally reminding him that the grave gapes for him thrice wider than for other men.
And then the final nail.
He declares, "I have turned away my former self. So will I those that kept me company." He commands Falstaff not to come within 10 miles of his royal person on pain of death.
Hazlitt's critique of this exact moment is central to the romantic interpretation of the play.
What does Hazlitt say?
Hazlitt writes that while the intellect might understand the historical and political necessity of the king distancing himself from a criminal element, the emotional core of the reader rejects it.
We just can't accept it emotionally.
As dramatic critics, Hazlitt says, we never could forgive the prince's treatment of Falstaff.
I understand the emotional devastation, but we have to look at the structural reality of Hal's position.
Right, he's the king now.
Right before this procession, the Lord Chief Justice confronted the new king with a stark warning. He told Hal that a monarch cannot allow justice to be plucked down from the bench by his friends.
You can't play favorites with the law.
Exactly. Hal was presented with a binary choice. He cannot be a loyal friend to a man who mocks the law and simultaneously be the supreme upholder of the law. The roles are fundamentally incompatible.
The Chief Justice frames it as an existential threat to the state. If you elevate Falstaff, you dismantle the social contract.
And Hal accepts this logic entirely. He actually confirms the Chief Justice in his power, promising to let the law guide his reign. The tragedy isn't that Hal made the wrong choice. The tragedy is that power demanded the choice be made at all.
To put on the new and gorgeous garment of majesty, Hal had to perform an amputation on his own soul.
He had to kill the warmth, the humor, the grace, and the unrestrained joy of his youth.
He had to internalize the cold pragmatism of his brother, Prince John, and the calculating strategy of his father to survive the throne.
This brings us to the final lingering question that Hazlitt poses to the reader.
What's the takeaway?
Hazlitt observes that despite the historical triumphs of King Henry V, despite the terror he struck into the French armies at Agincourt, for the modern reader, Falstaff is the better man of the two. We think of him and quote him oftener.
It forces us to define what true immortality really looks like.
Is an enduring legacy built on the cold, statuesque, blood-soaked pragmatism of a conqueror?
Or is true immortality found in the warm, boundless, laughter-inducing imagination of a man who lived entirely, unapologetically, for the joy of the present moment?
Is a question that challenges the modern pursuit of power and the sacrifices required to attain it.
That's the heart of this section.
This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. As you navigate your own responsibilities, we encourage you to reflect on what parts of your own former selves you may have had to banish to achieve your current definition of success. Consider the fog of rumor, the chimes at midnight, and perhaps allow yourself to cultivate a little of Falstaff's boundless joy. We'll see you in the next episode.